This is lesson 1006, Fighting World War I. Essential questions. What were battlefield conditions like during World War I? And why did the Allies actually win World War I? As we've already seen, and this is just a repeat, from 1870 to 1914, the growth of Maine, militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism greatly increased tensions among European nations. Nationalism among Slavs in the Balkans led to the assassination of Austrian heir to the throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, in 1914. The conflict between Serbia and Austria-Hungary triggered alliances that started World War I. And here's a very famous cartoon which illustrates how these alliances pulled countries into World War I. It begins with Serbia on the lower left, little Serbia, and he's saying, if you touch me, I'll. And here's Austria with his hand on Serbia's arm and a fist raise. If you make a move, I'll. And then here comes Russia behind with his arm on Austria's collar and his fist raised. And he's saying, if you hit that little feller, I'll. And of course, Russia and Serbia are allies. And then here comes Germany with a spiked helmet. If you strike my friend, I'll. And of course, Germany and Austria are allies. And here comes an ally of Russia. If you hit him, I'll, and that's France. And then coming up behind, hi there, if you don't, and that's England. Europe before the war, and then Europe at the outbreak of the war. And you've got the Central Powers in purple, and you've got the Allied powers in green. So the Central Powers are Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Bulgaria is also going to join the Central Powers. And then you've got the Allied powers in green, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and of course Serbia, where the war all started. When the war began in August 1914, Europeans were enthusiastic about fighting. And most people anticipated that the war would be over by Christmas 1914, and boy, were they wrong. And you can see here on the left, French recruits, they're smiling. They're happy to be going off to war. They think they're going to win easily. And then here are these German recruits on this train, and you've got all this writing here on the train. Ausflug nach Paris means it's an excursion to Paris. Auf Wiedersehen, auf dem Boulevard. We'll see each other again on the French Boulevard right there. And then to the right here, it says, there's something I can't read, and it says, into the fight. The point of my saber is itching. And so they have no idea what they're in for. When the war began, Germany's biggest fear was the potential of fighting a war on two fronts at the same time and having to split their forces. And they had dreaded this possibility literally for decades. Germany's solution was what was called the Schlieffen Plan, and that plan had been in development for a long time, and it involved quickly defeating France in the west first, and then sending troops to the east before Russia could fully mobilize for war. At first, when the war started, the Schlieffen Plan seemed to be working when the German army marched through Belgium and France and got within a few miles of Paris. But English, Belgian, and French troops managed to stop them, and they saved Paris at the Battle of the Marne. And you can see the Marne River right there north of Paris. Meanwhile, Russia mobilized faster than expected, so Germany had to divert troops from their French campaign. Because the Schlieffen Plan failed and fell short and was stopped, the Central Powers were forced to fight a two-front war for the next 4 years. The fighting between Germany and France was known as the Western Front. And then the fighting between the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, against Russia was known as the Eastern Front. By 1915, the war settled into a stalemate as each side fortified their positions with trenches. And here is an illustration of trench warfare. And the most important thing about this picture here is you've got the trenches on one side and you've got the enemy trenches on the other side here, and you've got a whole network of trenches, actually. And in between the two enemies, you've got what was called a no man's land. And that no man's land was filled with all kinds of trash and destroyed equipment, dead bodies, puddles of disgusting, dirty water, mud, barbed wire. So you name it, it was just a terrible place to try to spend a few seconds. Here is a picture of soldiers going over the top. Soldiers had very little decent food, and what food they had was often attacked by rats. And these rats were the size of small rabbits and badgers because they had fed on the decomposing bodies of dead soldiers. Those trenches would fill up with water a lot of times, and that water was absolutely full of terrible bacteria, which could eat your feet away, and it was called trench foot. New weapons were invented to try to break this stalemate of trench warfare and somehow win the war. For example, machine guns. The machine gun had been around since the 1800s, but it developed very quickly during World War I. Machine guns, such as the one shown here, slaughtered attacking soldiers and prevented significant movement on the Western Front for 3 years. They also had long-range artillery as a way to try to overcome the stalemate of trench warfare. Tanks were another way to try to overcome this stalemate, to try to somehow get over the trench and break the lines. Airplanes and zeppelins were another way to break trench warfare, to get over the trench and do the enemy damage. Flamethrowers and grenade launchers, same thing. Poison gas. Both sides used poison gases that burned the eyes, the skin, and the lungs and killed thousands of troops. After World War I, most countries agreed to ban chemical warfare. And in fact, even Hitler never used gas on the battlefield. Submarines. They were another way to try to gain an advantage and win the war. So here is a list. Poison gas, you've got the machine gun, tanks, the submarines, and these were all pieces of new technology that made a huge difference in the war. Just look at the casualties. You've got military deaths in the 30 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, the Russo-Japanese War, and World War I all compared, and look at the casualty rate in World War I. New weapons killed soldiers more effectively. During World War I, 8.5 million soldiers died and 21 million were wounded. Here's a nice picture of some guys getting together. They're veterans. They were served in the war, and now they're posing for a picture, smiling, and everything looks really happy. Until you look at the picture more closely and realize that none of them have any legs. Their legs were all blown off in the war by these new weapons. No matter how badly they tried, no matter how many new weapons they tried, no matter how many people were killed, fighting on the Western Front slowed to a stalemate as neither side could gain an advantage. During the 10-month Battle of Verdun in 1916, 1 million soldiers were killed or wounded. And then another 1 million soldiers were killed or wounded at the Battle of the Somme. So 4 main battles to keep in mind is the Battle of the Marne, the Battle of Ypres, that's spelled Y-P-R-E-S, you just call it Ypres, Verdun, and the Battle of the Somme. And the big takeaway here on this map is that almost no ground was gained of any significance. Despite the deaths, neither the Allies nor the Central Powers gained an advantage after these battles. On the Eastern Front, the Russian army was struggling to hold out against the German army. Russia was not as industrialized as the rest of Europe, and they failed to produce enough weapons or enough food. And here's a picture of Russian women training for combat. Millions of Russian soldiers and civilians died in the war. Not thousands, millions. By 1917, Russia was on the brink of collapse. The stalemate on the Western and Eastern fronts turned World War I into what we call a war of attrition. in which each side tried to outproduce and outlast the enemy. Whoever breaks first loses. Nations committed to what we call total war in order to win. In total war, factories were converted to make war equipment. Industrial resources were rationed in order to prioritize military needs. Governments used conscription to draft civilians into the military. Propaganda was used to maintain civilian support for the war. And overseas colonies were used to gain resources and additional soldiers. Let's look at this map and see how World War I impacted the whole planet. The main fighting of the war occurs in the western and eastern fronts of Europe. But the war also raged in Southeast Asia as Arab nationalists battled their Turkish rulers, the Ottoman Empire, one of the Central Powers. Japan declared war on Germany in 1914 and seized German colonies in China and in the Pacific. India provided about 1.3 million men to fight and labor alongside their British rulers throughout Europe. Both Austria and New Zealand fought on the side of the Allies and contributed many troops to the 1915 Gallipoli campaign in Southwest Asia. European colonies throughout Africa became a battlefield as warring parties struck at one another's colonial possessions. In South America, Brazil was the only South American country to enter the war, supporting the Allies with warships and personnel. And finally, the United States entered the war on the side of the Allies in 1917. Here's a picture of the Turkish cavalry. You have Sikh British soldiers in India, Chinese soldiers even. And here is a list of the Allies and the Central Powers during World War I, and you can see the Allies enjoyed a great superiority. To keep Germany from trading with other nations, Britain used its powerful navy to blockade Europe. Germany responded by using what we call unrestricted submarine warfare to attack the British Navy and any merchant ships that they thought was supplying the Allies with anything for the war effort. And that's why we call this unrestricted submarine warfare, because these submarines made no distinctions between battleships and passenger ships or cargo ships. And you can see the damage that they did. Each one of these dots represents a ship sunk by a German submarine between 1915 and 1917. German U-boat attacks, and a U-boat is simply the German word for submarine, played a role in bringing the United States into World War I. When World War I began in 1914, the United States remained neutral. But the USA was pulled into the war by 1917. As a neutral nation, the USA was trading with the Allies during the war. But Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare led to attacks on U.S. merchant ships and British passenger ships. President Woodrow Wilson demanded freedom of the seas, but Germany flatly refused. Americans were outraged in May 1915 when a German U-boat sank the British passenger ship Lusitania, killing 1,200 people, including 128 Americans. However, let's not overstate this. The United States still didn't enter the war for another 2 years. America's anger with Germany increased in 1917 after the discovery of the Zimmermann telegram. Germany knew that U-boat attacks would eventually bring the USA into the war. So Germany sent a telegram to Mexico proposing that Mexico attack the USA in exchange for the return of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Mexico declined the offer, and Americans were outraged. On April 2, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany and entered the war. The arrival of millions of American soldiers in 1918 gave a boost to the Allies, and it was just in time because in November 1917, Russia signed a peace treaty with Germany and exited the war. By 1918, the Central Powers were running out of supplies, and they tried a massive attack into France. But the Allies halted the attack and pushed back. Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, and Austria-Hungary surrendered in October 1918. On November 11th, 1918, Germany agreed to an armistice, a ceasefire, and World War I, at least the shooting part, finally came to an end. Military deaths in World War I. Nearly 10 million Allied and Central Powers soldiers died in the war. New weapons such as machine guns, mustard gas, and tanks greatly increased the casualties.